Like I'm my friends, like I've been over so many times, like for fun. I'm like going here.
Yeah. Yeah, there's like a ton of places like I want to do the copy
Science.
Yeah.
Have you never been there, but there's not like
Hello. You got it? You good? Okay. Let's go ahead and get started. We have a packed house, so we are going to ask everybody to squeeze in. I know the students are giving up some of their seats, and I appreciate that. So hopefully we'll be able to get everybody in. We did try. We knew that this was going to be a well-attended event in the last couple days. We did try to move it. Unfortunately, as you can see, all the other rooms were packed tonight. So, but we are, for those of you who have friends, you can text them, message them that we are doing a live, Facebook Live broadcast of this panel discussion. And all they have to do is go to the Press Democrat Facebook page, and they can see it there. And it also will be available. An archive of the video will be available on the Press Democrat website as beginning tomorrow, what I'm told. Anyway, let me introduce myself. I'm Paul Gullickson. I am the faculty advisor for the Sonoma State Star. I'm also the editorial director for the Press Democrat. And on behalf of the Star, we'd like to welcome you to Sonoma State and to our panel discussion today on fake news and the First Amendment. We think we'll have should be a very interesting discussion. It's obviously an issue of great importance in our politics today, in our conversations. It's a very polarizing issue, but this should also be a very interesting discussion because, as you all know, today is Talk Like a Pirate Day. So we will be very interested to hear what they have to say and to hear it in their best pirate accents. So, I told you I was going to throw you a curve. So, anyway, we would ask that we do our best. I hope everybody got a program. There are refreshments out there. We are going to have, the first part of our forum is going to be, I'm going to provide an overview of the issue. We are going to have a discussion, and we will be opening up to questions. We will have a couple of our students handing out cards. If those of you can ask your questions from the microphone or pose them, write them down on a card and submit them. And those who are watching from home and would like to pose a question, you're invited to pose them as well. One of our students will write down the questions and submit them to us as well. So on that note, I would like to introduce our other sponsor for this evening, David Snyder and the First Amendment Coalition.
Thanks, Paul. Can you hear me? Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming out. I know it's asking a lot to set aside time from your evening at this time of the evening. It's really heartening to see that so many people are engaged and interested on this issue. Can everybody hear me in the back? A little louder? Okay. The full title of tonight's event is Fake News and the First Amendment, the Search for Truth in a Post-Truth Age. You'll notice we didn't put quotation marks around post-truth. So does that mean that we think, or that I think, that truth is no longer relevant, or that we've somehow gone past the need for truth? Quite to the contrary. I think facts and truth are more important now than they've been in a long, long time. That said, I think there's a sense among a lot of people that what we mean by facts and what we mean by truth and the weight that we put on those has somehow shifted substantially recently. That the ground has sort of shifted underneath us, and that those terms somehow mean something different than they used to. So what about the search for facts and the search for truth? We live in an age where you can access the most arcane information, the most obscure facts on any topic that you could possibly imagine at a keystroke. It's really phenomenal. If you want to know what Mickey Mantle's batting average was in 1961, you get that in 2 seconds. If you want to know what Mickey Mantle's batting average was in July of 1961, you get that at a keystroke. What did Star Wars gross in its first week at the box office? You can find that out in about 3 seconds. At the same time, I think a lot of people have the sense that finding valuable information and truthful information is harder than ever in some ways. We have this ocean of facts out there, but not a drop to drink as far as finding valid, true facts goes. So where does that leave us? I think everyone now has the power and the ability to be their own reporter and their own editor to some degree. But with that comes a burden and an obligation. We have, because of the way the media landscape has shifted, everybody now sort of has an obligation, if they choose to accept it, to figure out whether what they're reading comes from a credible source, whether what they're reading is factual, and whether what their friends are sharing on Facebook and Twitter is factual. And that speaks to a larger trend that I think goes alongside this idea that basically any fact is available for anybody's inspection at any time. And that is, we can all sort of curate our own reality now in a way that wasn't possible even 10 years ago, much less 20 years ago. In your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed, you can edit out before they've even spoken people whose viewpoints you think you disagree with. You can funnel only viewpoints that you agree with to your Facebook and Twitter feed. And if your Facebook and Twitter feed is your only source for news, that means that you're simply not seeing a large swath, a large part of the spectrum of political beliefs. So all of that comes down to a question that I think, again, is raised by our title, the First Amendment. What does the First Amendment have to do with that? We'll get into that on the panel. But the bottom line is that all of these activities are protected by the First Amendment. Everyone has a First Amendment right to receive information, and everyone has a right to speak and to publish as they see fit, with some narrow, well-defined exceptions. So it is a free-for-all. And I think it's a free-for-all that the Founding Fathers envisioned and maybe even encouraged when they drafted the First Amendment. So again, I think it's up to all of us ultimately to figure out what's true and what's false, and or at least what sources of information there are that are the most reliably truthful. So how to do that is one of the things I think we're going to talk about on the panel. I'll stop talking now, except to give you a brief description of what my organization does. The First Amendment Coalition is a nonprofit, nonpartisan group based in San Rafael. We promote the right of free speech. We promote access to government records and government meetings with the overall objective of increasing the transparency and the accountability of government. That's our mission, and it's been our mission since we started in 1988. And we are a member supported organization. So if you feel moved to do so, please contribute. We're coming to the end of a fundraising cycle, and it would be great to have contributions. You can also sign up as a member to the First Amendment Coalition. That's free. For more information about what we do, there's a variety of materials on the table just outside the door. Thank you again so much for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. It's great to see so many people out.
Okay, now let's meet our other panelists. Can you hear me okay? Is this good? Okay. First, we'll start at the end. We have Annika Tornquist. My Swedish is not very good. Is the digital director of Sonoma Media Investments, where she manages the products, including web development and social media, for the Press Democrat, Argus Courier, the Sonoma Index Tribune, North Bay Business Journal, and Sonoma Magazine, which are all the products of Sonoma Media Investments. Thank you, Annika, for being here. Dave McEwen, most of you may know him already when he's not picking Pinot grapes, which he's been doing abundantly lately, is a political science professor here at Sonoma State. His expertise is in two broad areas, including American politics and international relations, with a particular emphasis on elections. And then we have Carl Olson, is a First Amendment attorney and partner with Kanata, O'Toole, Fix, and Almazan in San Francisco. He specializes in defending news media clients and individuals against defamation and SLAPP suits. That's another panel to talk about SLAPP suits. But Carl also has the distinction of being a former Sonoma State student long ago, who actually wrote for a newspaper at Sonoma State. It wasn't the Star back then, it was something else.
The Sonoma State Morning Glory.
The Morning Glory. I can't imagine why they changed that name. Anyway, thanks to Carl for being. Carl gave up his Giants tickets to be with us tonight. That's a huge. But I suggested we might outdraw the Giants tonight. I don't know. I am a big Giants fan. And then, of course, you met David Snyder, the Executive Director of First Amendment Coalition. What's interesting about David is he is also a lawyer and a former journalist. He worked as a reporter for nearly 16 years, working at such publications as the Albuquerque Tribune, the Dallas Morning News, the New York Times as a freelancer, and the Washington Post, where I believe he worked in the Metro desk for 5 years or so. Yeah. So please, let's give him a round of applause. So I want to. I'm just going to provide a little bit of an overview. David's already done some of that, but I just want to kind of get into the semantics a little bit of fake news, okay? Reality is that 2 in 5 people in the nation get all their news online. 2 out of 5 right now get all their news online, where fake news is most prevalent, as we all know. 23% report having shared made-up news stories in some capacity. 59% of links on Twitter are shared, unread, and unviewed by the person sharing them, the actual tweeting of other information. They see the tweet to a story, they just pass it on without really even clicking through, you know what I mean? And 64%, nearly 2/3 of adults, say fake news causes confusion about current issues and events. 64%, I believe that represents many of us here. So the question is, though, is many people, and I can tell you in the news media itself, well, let me get this thing right. I don't know if you can read this cartoon. This is from Oman and Sacramento Bee, but in the first square, it shows a reporter at this her cubicle on her screen, and it says, she writes about City Hall, discovers misuse of funds. Next screen, this reporter writes about weather, warning you about incoming tornadoes. This reporter writes about your kid's high school basketball team victory. This reporter writes about toxic waste spill in your river. And the final panel says, enemy of the people, question mark, yeah, right, W-R-I-T-E. That sort of reflects what many of us in the profession are feeling these days. We've never been criticized and attacked so much by certainly a president, but really so much of our dynamic and our interactions, our civil interactions, are targeted toward media. And so one of the questions we're going to get at is, you know, what is really going on here and what's at play? So that begins with the question is, so what is fake news? Okay, and we want to try to frame this a little bit. And I think as part of this discussion, I think we can set aside the president's definition of fake news, right? I mean, I think he sort of uses it any time in reference to something he doesn't like or casts him in a poor light. So it's rather amorphous, subjective sort of definition that doesn't really help us all in knowing where to apply it. And I would also suggest, for the sake of discussion, that fake news also isn't news that is honestly maybe incorrect. I mean, we see that happen where reporters make mistakes and they get quickly attacked as fake news. Well, the reality is, what do you do to correct it? What do you do after you find out what you wrote was incorrect? What effort do you make to go back and set the record straight? And that will show whether or not, you know, in my mind, whether you have credibility and whether you're really interested in making sure the the news is accurate. And most mainstream papers and a lot of bloggers too will be quick to point out, hey, I made a mistake. And I applaud those who send out tweets and they realize they made a mistake because it was sending around a fake news report and they try to dial it back. And I applaud them every time I see that happen. So then our staff at the Sonoma State Star, we actually sat down in a discussion about a year ago and said, well, how do we really want to define fake news? Because what's an operative definition? And we talked about it for a while. We came up with this, that fake news is a news report published or released with knowledge of its falsehood or a willful disregard for its accuracy and with the intent to deceive the public. I really like this definition. I really applauded them for coming up with this because it has two really important key aspects that differentiate it from all the many things. And that is the willful disregard for its accuracy. Was the content distributed in a way that the person knew it was false or just really suspected it was false? And the other issue was the intent to deceive the public. And we're going to get into at the end later on about how you distinguish between real news sites and fake news. And it often comes down to what is the intent of the author of that piece or the organization behind that piece. Was their purpose to try to educate the public, or they tried to steer people toward a certain ideology or affirm a certain belief, and not really trying to distribute truth? So we'll come back to that definition hopefully a little bit later. So I also want to break our discussion down into basically three areas of fake news, if you will. One is what we see a lot on social media, the kinds of messages that are forwarded, shared, liked, that turn out not to be true. And many of that's us. That's us and our neighbors. We fall for stuff, we make a mistake, but we went ahead and shared it, and now we try to get it back and get it right. The other one is the pseudo-news media. And by this I mean, and I would group groups like InfoWars, who have a huge following, or some of you may have seen the interview that Scott Pillay of 60 Minutes had of Michael Cernovich from Danger and Play website. His whole purpose is to promote. They're the ones who are behind the story about how Hillary Clinton has Parkinson's, and the source of that story was an anesthesiologist friend of his who had never examined Hillary Clinton in his life, but it sounded like a good story, and he quoted him accurately, so he claims the story was accurate. And so it's websites like this that just promote rumor and speculation and outright hoaxes, but refuse to dial it back and correct the record straight because they're trying to provoke an emotion and an ideology. And the last one is really important thing. And you've seen this one a lot in the news lately. We're going to get to that too. And it's about the intervention of entities abroad, and I will say particularly Russia's influence in the spreading of false news, fake news within our public discourse. So these are some just examples I'll run through quick. Recently we had a lot of fake news surrounding hurricanes Irma and Harvey. In fact, the National Weather Service did something I can't remember them ever doing before, which actually is sending out a warning, not about weather, but about information that was going out about weather. There was a hoax going out that was circulated by tens of thousands of people, that Hurricane Irma was going to be a Category 6 earthquake. It's a Category 6 hurricane, and as those of you know, there is no Category 6 hurricane. And then it was headed straight for Houston. And so you had a bunch of people who were still canoeing to get to their homes in Houston, and there was a lot of fear being spread because of this viral hoax. And they sent out a warning that this was not true. And then, of course, there's all these other things, all these other news reports. This is a tweet that went out about the jets at the Houston airport being up to their wings in water. Well, I fell for this. I'm telling you, I'm showing you ones I fell for, right? And I'm very discerning, at least I like to believe. This actually was a photoshopped photo of what LaGuardia Airport, New York, might look like if climate change remains unreversed and with the storm surge happens in about 30 years. Same with this one. This is a silly one that I shared with my wife, and we awed about over one morning about all the red crabs going across the room and one of the road and one of the keys after Hurricane Irma, and we just marveled at this. Some of you may have read my column. I mentioned this. We marveled at all these red. Isn't nature amazing? Look at all these red crabs. Well, it turns out it's completely bogus. It's actually something from migration of red crabs in Christmas Island out of the Indian Ocean. I fell hook, line, and sinker for that. But then there are ones that are much more serious. And this one is actually a photo taken of one of the protests after the Ferguson shootings that happened at the time. And somebody took the photo of people blocking the highways. I believe this is actually taken over in Oakland. And they posted it, and they said, "Black Lives Matter thugs blocking emergency crews from reaching hurricane victims." And so this started circulating on the internet and started drawing a lot of discussion about, how awful, Black Lives Matter protesters are. And it's complete fabrication. But, as Mark Twain once said, a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth ever gets its boots on. And I'm not sure, but I think that was before the internet. So, and then of course there's much more serious ones, and you have, obviously the stories of Hillary Clinton sold weapons to ISIS. That was a popular one, and of course the most devastating or most popular was Pope endorses Trump. This was produced by a pseudo news station out of near Chicago, and they're not quite sure. They're still to this day not quite sure who was behind it, but it had more than 1 million shares on Facebook prior to the election, and so these things have real consequences. So the question is, what are some of the consequences? Well, it spreads misinformation. But it has real consequences. Many of you know the story about the Pizzagate story that circulated that Hillary Clinton was behind some child sex trafficking operation out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. This was right before the election again. A lot of these were very popular before the election. Some guy got in his car from North Carolina, was tired of the fact that nobody was doing anything to save these poor children, got in his car with his automatic weapon, drove all the way to Washington, D.C., kicked in the door, started shooting up the pizza place, only to find that all it had there was a bunch of pizza and beer, and there were no children being abused, and now his life is basically over. So there are, and people like Alex Jones and Michael Cernovich, they're pushing these stories, and they're not taking any ownership to it, but there are real consequences of what happened, and of course, the biggest consequences may be related to the election outcomes. And we saw a real spike in fake news prior to the election. A BuzzFeed news analysis found that top fake election news stories generated more total engagement on Facebook than the top election stories from 19 major news outlets combined. More, and there was another study out from Oxford, some of you may have seen this, that looked at just the news coverage in Michigan prior to the election, the month before the election, and they found that the amount of information that was shared via social media prior to the election, it was about 50-50 real news and fake news. The fake news was actually as much as the real news. Why is that significant? Anybody remember how much Trump won Michigan by? 10,000 people, about as many as there are students here at Sonoma State. Think about that. So it didn't take many for them to have an impact. And of course, BuzzFeed looked at, they actually tracked it and found there was actually more fake news you can see it by the red line. There was actually more fake news shared prior to the election than real news back right leading up to election day. So all of this is there's real, and these are some of the stories. I won't go through them all. Pope endorses Donald Trump. I still have a family member I believe who believes that. I can't convince him otherwise. Some of you have heard me say that. Hillary selling weapons to ISIS. So these are some of the most popular stories. But again, it's not just the anti-Clinton messages. There are plenty of messages on both sides. One of the fake social media shared Facebook pages was about there was a picture of Obama serving supposedly hurricane victims of Harvey, and the tag was, "This is something you'll never see Trump do." Well, it was a bogus post because it was a photo of Obama working at a Thanksgiving dinner in 2015. But a lot of people shared that, saying, "Wow, look, Obama went down there and helped out with the hurricane victims." So it can be a weapon on both sides. And now this is the issue where we find ourselves today. This is the new face of fake news. Okay, this is a nice family from Pennsylvania. A dad posts a picture of his daughter with butterfly face paint. Looks really nice. He refers his followers to go to a DC Links website. Says, "Hey, there's some information here about Hillary Clinton you might want to read." What's the problem with this? Well, our friend Melvin Reddick doesn't exist. He was actually created by a Russian company with ties to the Kremlin, driving people to a website, DC Links, which was created by an arm of the Russian military. And they were promoting information that had been hacked from the Democratic Party website. So they were taking information, promoting it, and then creating fake accounts, Facebook and tweets, in order to promote this information and help circulate it. And of course, where does he circulate it? Well, Pennsylvania, as a swing state, Michigan, Wisconsin. Facebook just acknowledged there was a story in the New York Times by about two weeks ago that delved into this, and New York Times has pulled down about 500 fake accounts like this, in addition to another 500 accounts that were selling ads targeted, pushing these kinds of stories to micro-target groups. And the way you can do it on Facebook, you can sell to middle-aged white males in Michigan, and you can really focus on who it is you want that message to go to. So this is the third aspect of fake news that's out there, and it's having a real insidious impact. This is the story that I mentioned. Fake American Russian created to influence the election. You're going to hear more about this, and Facebook is finally owning up to its responsibilities. But we'll get on to that. That's kind of an overview. We're gonna get into some of this right now. Why don't we start with our questions and our panelists? Okay, ready? Okay. Let me first start with David. Let's go to you. This kind of fake news has been around for a while. What is it that's making it so popular now that that it's becoming such a dominant part in our interactions nowadays?
As you say it, fake news isn't new. There are some great and sort of humorous, in retrospect, examples of fake news. There's one famous one called the Great Moon Hoax, which was a series of stories that the New York Sun, which was a fairly large paper at the time, ran in 1835 about how scientists had discovered life on the moon. And this entire series of stories, which was intentionally fabricated to drive up circulation, had these outlandish drawings which depicted these crazy creatures on the surface of the moon. And do we have this?
Oh, is that the last one?
Yeah, that final slide. Just because I think it adds a little levity to the conversation.
There you go.
So that ran in the New York Sun. This is the life that was found on the moon.
And you're saying it's not true?
Okay. I don't think so.
Okay.
But this series of stories fits the definition that your students came up with. It was intentionally created with the objective of deceiving its audience. And there are other examples of this. There was another New York paper that ran a story about a rhinoceros that broke out of the Bronx Zoo and was rampaging through the streets and I think led a procession of all of the other zoo animals. Again, intentionally created false news. So it's not new. We also have examples of reporters at establishment publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post who created stories out of whole cloth. A famous example at the Washington Post was Janet Cook in 1982, I think it was. She did a series of stories about an 8-year-old heroin addict who didn't exist. Once the newspaper found out that the story wasn't true, they fired her, and they did a long period of soul searching and did a full explanation to their readership and sort of explained what happened. More recently, there's the example of Stephen Glass at the New Republic, who invented large portions of a number of newspaper stories, magazine stories. But again, once his deception was discovered by the publication, there was a sort of apology to the readers, and he was fired, and recently was denied admission to the California State Bar, as a matter of fact, because of those lies. So fake news is not new, but something new is going on, and I think there are two components to the newness. One is a kind of a structural cause, and the other is more of a social or political cause. The structural cause is that not all that long ago, there were a series of gatekeeper organizations, companies, that basically determined what we could and couldn't watch or learn or know about. The New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC News, CBS News, and NBC News. And then an assortment of local newspapers. Those were the gatekeepers. And if you wanted other information, there weren't a whole lot of options out there to get it. And that system has all kinds of problems with it. And I think the way we operate today in the media world is in many ways preferable. But one thing that system did is it kept truly ridiculous and false stuff kind of out of general circulation. And that's not to say that system was better on balance, but it did have that benefit. We no longer really have that. All of those institutions still exist, but they don't serve the same kind of fundamental gatekeeper role that they once did. Now, it's often said, anybody with an internet connection can have their own newspaper, they can have their own platform that millions and millions of people can see. When the internet was first really taking off, that was it was a thing that a lot of people said, anybody can have an audience of millions. Well, in reality, that wasn't really true. I mean, you put up a website, put a bunch of garbage on it, no one's going to actually go to the website. What I think put fuel on the fire of that structural phenomenon that has really contributed to fake news is social media. Because we now have, in the social media environment, it's possible people pay a lot less attention to where things are coming from and pay more attention to what it is they want to see. And they don't, often in your social media feed, it lacks context. You see a headline, you see one line, then you share it. And so we see stories that if they'd just been posted on the internet in the year 2000, would have never gotten any attention, get a lot of attention if they go viral. And they're shared across Twitter and across Facebook, and so gain sort of traction in a way that they certainly wouldn't have gotten in the age of the gatekeepers, and probably wouldn't have gotten in the pre-social media age either. So that's a sort of structural component. There's a social, political element to this as well, and that's people can sort of create their own reality or unreality. As I mentioned at the outset in my introduction, with your Twitter feed or Facebook feed, you can create a world, you can sort of create the world that you want to see, or the world that you believe is true. So you can exclude people who have viewpoints that differ from yours. You can include only those who you think are likely to tell you what it is you believe is true or what you want to be true. And I think that makes people generally more susceptible to believing or giving credence to things that they otherwise might say, that's a little crazy, that's outlandish. Because if all you see every day is kind of one narrow band of the spectrum of reality, things that are false may not necessarily appear as false because you don't have a broader context to understand those in. So in this kind of social and political environment, combined with the structural changes we've seen, we see the result of that was a real explosion of the fake news phenomenon starting last summer and fall.
Well, okay, given that you have an environment now where the trust in media, all media, is at a significant low point, right? At an all-time low. So the question is, in this environment, how put your hat on as a journalist? What is it that the mainstream media aren't doing to help control it, report on what's happening, or combat this, because we're getting swept up in all of this, and some people are just being turned off entirely and saying, I'm just going to go watch Game of Thrones and not pay any attention anyway.
Yeah, so what can the traditional media do to combat fake news? I mean, that's $1 million question, and I don't know that I have a quick and easy answer for it, other than, first, I think that traditional media outlets have to just keep doing what they do, but do it even better than they've done it before. Do a better job at corroborating your facts, getting your facts straight, getting the story right, and I'm a believer in the idea that the truth will ultimately out. I think lies can succeed in the short term, but I think in the long term, I have faith and maybe some misplaced optimism that ultimately the truth wins out, and that the newspapers and media institutions that stick to their fundamental principles, the things that students are learning in your class, Paul, and at newspapers all around the country, that approach will ultimately prevail. One thing I hope is that the traction that we've seen fake news get is a blip, that we're seeing a phenomenon that is going to fade with time, because I think and hope that people will realize that what journalism outlets do is very rarely, never perfect, and it's very often deeply flawed. But it's kind of the best we've got, and they are companies filled with people who have devoted their professional lives to communicating true facts and to analyzing politics. And that this model of a professional approach and obligation to ensuring that the readers understand their world better than they did before they picked up the newspaper or looked at the website will ultimately win out, because it is at least it provides a better chance that people will be able to read and understand the truth than the fake news outlets.
Well, I hope you're right. I mean, one of the concerns that for us in the media is we spend so much time dealing with fake news and trying to argue the facts and the truth about things that we should be well past and not have to deal with, that the consequence of that is that real news doesn't get covered. I mean, honestly, my opinion is I feel like the opioid crisis in this nation has never gotten the attention because we're so busy chasing the president's tweets. It's just an example of some of the stories that are not being covered. Well, to move on, I'd like to move to the political arena, and I'm going to move to Dave McEwen on this. Dave, I'll ask you the same question. You know, propaganda, spin, disinformation, these are nothing new to politics. So why is there suddenly this becoming a more successful tool, particularly in political campaigns?
Okay, so what I'd like to do is kind of explain how social scientists think about this. And I don't know that we've gone far enough in categorizing how 2016 was so different. This is paradigm shattering. This is not old media versus new media. This isn't insiders versus outsiders or campaigns versus journalists. This is a completely different model. Bots cannot be geolocated. We cannot determine the financing behind them. The old adage of transparency and disclosure that we got, say, after Watergate or when McCain Feingold or under campaign finance, or isn't it quaint to find out who funded a television ad? All of that is gone. And it's very difficult to legislate that. It's very difficult to deal with that in terms of how the game has shifted. I mean, we really have entered the matrix. So with that kind of introduction, let me explain why this technique works. This is far beyond micro-targeting. Micro-targeting began in the 1960s, 1970s, obviously rose during advances in computerization, but we're not talking about micro-targeting. We're talking about the ability to grab 4,000 to 5,000 data points for every individual, every adult in the United States. Everyone. There's complete illusion of privacy. So if you think you want to have a private browser and all that kind of stuff, forget it. You're going to use something like Wickr, which the White House will be using over the next 9 to 12 months so that they can communicate and not have it picked up by an independent prosecutor. You can use Inspire or Confide. These are tools that were created and are used by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, And they are hugely effective ways to communicate. Campaigns can do this, and there's no way to track them. A program called Vanish is another program. These are all on my iPhone, and they're on every iPhone of every terrorist or every criminal or every syndicate or every organization that's involved with trying to hide their identity. But if you can also grab, from a campaign perspective, 4,000 to 5,000 data points for every adult in the United States, it means we are far beyond micro-targeting. Here's what happens. We are at screen-level targeting. That means individual screens. And you have multiple screens in your life. You have your PC or your Mac, you have your iPhone, and you have every other device, your iPad and so forth. That's screen-level targeting, individualized for each device you're on, not just your IP address or just your home, every device you're on. That also includes classified content that's classified or goes to you, so the 64% of you will retweet it without looking at it, so that you'll move forward past it because you know you can trust it, you don't have to look at it. That's pretty sophisticated. And that creates what's known as analyzed sentiment. So we have three things: screen level targeting, classified content, and analyzed sentiment. That creates what social psychologists call motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning. And that's the belief that lies are something someone else does, or what social psychologists called in the 1960s foreclosure effects, or what some of you might derisively call the Fox News effect, or the other side might call the NPR effect. But that idea of motivated reasoning is very difficult to get past. And you can deliver that for across 4,000 or 5,000 variables for each individual, which means you can push past and have entered a completely new paradigm to reach every single voter in 16 battleground states, which is exactly what Project Alamo was about for the Trump campaign.
Yeah, I was reading a study about how they were actually gauging how people's emotional investment in wanting to believe something's true, and how much that is a vulnerability or an opportunity for some people with their messaging, that you don't have to worry about how accurate it is.
It creates emotional fluency, is what we call it. You know something to be true because you know it is thus.
Right.
And it creates a fluency of your emotions that joins your brain pattern to know this is what's going on. And so that locks people into a pattern of behavior of moving forward.
Yeah. It's my feeling we move from the age of reason to the age of emotion. And if you feel something, it must be true, and you can certainly find the information to support that out there, or whole communities to support it.
And if we could kind of piggyback, the day after the election, or the night of the election, when everyone is stunned about what has happened, that creates a sense or a lack of control over what's happening. And this is perhaps what Trump motivated many of Trump voters, because they were feeling this sense of loss of control since 2008, under the Great Recession and so forth. As you experience that loss of control, you are more likely to hold on to misperception and misstatements and beliefs, and it becomes very difficult to change those things. You know that Russia was involved, you know that XYZ happened in the election, and therefore when you're even presented with counter-information, for all of you that are here tonight, it gets very difficult to move you as well when things don't fit that pattern. So this puts us in a place that we can drive messages to you in a campaign that are fundamentally different, and challenges what we will see in 2020 and 2018, especially with the rise of the bots, which can't be located, we can't understand the financing. I mean, this is not the wild, wild west. It is the matrix at some level. Completely different paradigm, because it's difficult to ascribe transparency and disclosure for who owns what's going on. And it's going to be difficult to legislate that, especially given our First Amendment securities or tendencies with past precedent.
And David mentions the bots. Some of you may not may be aware of what we're talking about. Things that if you want to create a Twitter account right now, you tweet something, you might have 10 or 20 friends respond to it or forward it. But you can actually go out and buy bots, many of them from Russia, to actually promote your tweets. And within 1 minute, after activating them, you can have 20 to 30,000 tweets on your tweet. So it gives the impression that many people are liking and forwarding what you had to write, even though no human actually has seen it. It's just a computerized technology that allows people. And so when you get a tweet, not only we're in an age now, you not only just start to question the information, question the source, whether the source is real, because we're finding more and more on that note.
Well, what Paul's talking about are these generators for bots, and the generators for bots literally happen thousands within a second, and the generators are undisclosed. They don't have to be disclosed, and there's no way to determine their origin, and they're automated. So they can be sent or generated from anywhere of anything that's connected to the internet. So this doesn't have to be Russia. It could be anyone. We could set them up here, generate a bot, and generate thousands of hits from that bot within a couple of seconds by the time I've finished just these few words.
But just one more question. You know, there used to be a political consequence for lying and for spreading false news. People got nabbed for it. I mean, I believe that's what Nixon's downfall was. The committee to re-elect the president, this kind of stuff was out there, but there was a political consequence to when that was uncovered. Why does there seem to be no political consequence anymore? Or are we going to find out in 2018 or 2020?
Yeah, I think that there is a political consequence. One is that all of you are here tonight, so first, thank you. And folks are paying attention. Young people are paying attention when they didn't pay attention to politics before. Folks are trying to understand what the bots are about. So actually, I think all of us on the panel are half full as to the value of political information is higher. The question is, how are we going to legislate or move forward with something from a policy prescription, from a policy perspective, to deal with this. I deal with dozens of reporters a day. Dozens of reporters, and many of you know this. They cannot tell their editors they don't know anything about politics. They can't do that. So what they do is they need to call on people to discuss how they're covering stories and what's going on, where to chase those things. And that is regardless of the medium, whether that's TV or radio or print. Because the whole media landscape having changed, they're not bloggers, but the whole media landscape having changed means that we don't have checks. And so one thing that can be done is when the media does have corrections, it has visual corrections, and they are not fact-check politimeters, because we've measured that. And if you're in a misinformation, disinformation environment, voters negate that and don't change their views. So how you actually do corrections needs to change from the media's perspective, and voters need to be aware of that when it happens, because the mechanism that's happened that the media has used across all medias, or all medium types, for the last 100 years doesn't work, and we have data to prove it. So the idea of PolitiFact and these types of things, it doesn't motivate voters, but visual correctives need to change for increasing the information fluency that folks have.
Well, we're going to come back to that, but I want to get to Carl. Carl, I want to get into the First Amendment angle here. Is it true? I'm going to throw you a softball here. Is the First Amendment protect fake news in your view?
It depends on how you define fake news. I mean, generally speaking, it does. The First Amendment protects erroneous statements, and the Supreme Court has said that erroneous statements are inevitable in free debate. But it was interesting you showing the STARS definition of fake news that says something that someone knows is false, because the definition of actual malice in the famous case of New York Times versus Sullivan is knowledge of falsity or reckless disregard as to truth or falsity, entertaining serious doubt about whether something is true or false. So by that definition of fake news, it's not protected, or at least if a public figure can show actual malice, then they can win a libel case. But generally speaking, the First Amendment is going to protect what you might call fake news. It's going to protect mistakes. And there's really not any legislative remedy for it either.
Let's talk about it. I mean, we certainly saw a lot of attempts at it after the 2016 election. There were a number of bills submitted at here in the California legislature having to do with regulating fake news. You're on the board of the First Amendment Coalition. The First Amendment Coalition basically opposed many of them. You want to talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, there was one bill which would have gone really far, way too far, and it read, It's unlawful for a person to knowingly and willingly make, publish, or circulate on a website or cause to be made a false or deceptive statement designed to influence the vote on either of the following. Any issue submitted to voters at an election or any candidate for election to public office. In other words, everything that's said in a campaign is a crime. Well, that didn't go very far. And that was quickly withdrawn by the author of the bill. It was heavily criticized by the First Amendment Coalition and other civil rights groups. A very, very much narrower version of that, aimed at just sort of cyber squatting, sort of stealing someone else's domain name or something like that, did pass and has not been vigorously opposed. But you're not going to be able to legislate truth. And the problem of fake news is not entirely not entirely new. None other than Thomas Jefferson said, quote, "Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle." Well, that was before the internet, before the telephone, before the car.
Well, I never liked that quote.
Well,
we all have a bad day.
There's another Jefferson.
There's another one in Thomas Jefferson, and perhaps
That's the one we like.
perhaps when he had been endorsed by some paper, said, if I had to choose between government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate to choose the latter. So.
And that was engraved in marble in the lobby of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which of course is not with us anymore. But yeah. So, but that's. I may have overstated. For disclosure purposes, I am also on the board of the First Amendment Coalition. In fact, I'm on the legislative committee. We looked at these issues. In fact, there were a couple bills came through by our local legislators. Bill Dodd had a bill that was going to require the teaching of discerning between fake news and real news in the school system. We wrestled with that. I don't think FAC actually took a position.
I don't think we actually took it.
We wrestled with that just because we already put so many requirements on our school teachers. We obviously support the teaching of that, but it shouldn't. We hesitate at requiring one more mandate. And then I believe Mark Levine had a bill that was going to require the teaching as well of Russian involvement in the 2000 election. Again, another issue that should be. We don't even know what the story is yet. Hope, or perhaps our friend Bob Mueller will help explain it for us, and I certainly expect that will be taught. But one more mandate, and both those bills did fail, as I recall. Did you have something else you want to add?
Yeah, just briefly, I want to make a point coming off of what Carl said. The efforts in California to sort of legislate fake news, they failed. And especially the one that Carl addressed first failed very quickly. But I think the fact that these bills were introduced, combined with some other bills from more Republican-dominated states, I think says a lot. So a number of Republican state legislatures proposed, and I don't think any of these passed, but proposed bills that would have essentially criminalized the act of protesting. So there was one state, I think it was South Dakota, but I could be wrong about that, that would have essentially allowed somebody to hit somebody with a car as long as that person were unlawfully in a roadway while protesting. These sort of crazy ideas that I think are coming from both the left and the right that speak to, for lack of a better term, a kind of craziness that has been let loose in the land, and a sort of irrationality among legislators and maybe everybody else. I think people are motivated by fear more than they have been in some time, and I think people on the left and the right are motivated that way. I think the election of Trump has caused people to become kind of hyper-emotional in a way that makes them forget what our founding documents are about. So you saw, for example, a letter that 100 or more University of California, Berkeley professors wrote to the administration at that school demanding that the school not allow Milo Yiannopoulos to speak at all at the school. Now, Milo Yiannopoulos is a bomb thrower, and he says horrible, offensive things. And if the university were to endorse him, that's one thing. But what these professors were asking for was what's called a prior restraint. They were asking for the government to shut down a speaker before he even spoke. And that is an extraordinarily rare remedy under First Amendment law. It's something that just isn't done, except under very narrow circumstances. The fact that it was 100 professors at this prestigious university who, in my view, really should know better, I think says something about the political environment that we're in. What that something is, I'm not sure. Dave probably would be able to articulate much better.
We want to believe in some ways that we can ban our way out of this problem and find a quick fix, and that's the dangerous thing. Okay, I want to bring Annika in this conversation. She's chomping the bit to join in, and so Annika, we've sort of established that we probably can't count on our politicians to change. There's probably not a legislative fix in the works. Let's talk. Is there a technological fix that can come from this, and what are we seeing that's happening out there?
Well, so Google and Facebook and Twitter, they have been. I mean, a lot of people have asked for a long time if they actually should do something, or what can they do. So they're really hesitant for obvious reasons. It's hard. What do you do? How do you handle it? Who makes the call? What is fake and not? But there are some things happening. So if you go to Google, for example, and you look for stories. Sorry, you need to get it up.
Yeah, but is that on?
Is it higher?
Maybe we can turn it up a little bit.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. If you go to Google, for example, and you look for questionable stories, you will see a little fact check below where it calls out and has a link to fact checking like 80 Facts or Snopes. I have some examples here. I think it's further. There you go. So that's another one. Facebook also has something, a factor. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there's Bing and Google. So they have a little thing there underneath stories about the stories about the Reese's peanut butter cups being discontinued. A lot of uproar about that. Of course, really important news.
Oh, that hurts.
Yeah, that hurts. And I'm Swedish, so I don't care at all for that family. But the rest of the world was upset, and it turned out this was fake. So if you look for stories and you wonder, you should now actually Google is pretty good at doing this. You can see that as a way to get some help.
It says Reese's peanut butter cups to be discontinued, ? And there's a little line underneath that says fact checked by Snopes, false. So they are trying to, as Annika said, they are trying to flag that more.
But you have to make an effort. Like if I'm online constantly, night and day pretty much, and I really don't run into much fake news because I don't read those kind of stories usually, and they don't bump up in my feed or they don't show up on Facebook. So it depends very much. You have to make an effort, depending what you do, of course. But I'm just saying that you have to work hard to find them, I would say, in general. On Facebook, they also have a fact alert to some stories. And they also have a way for you to report if you think something is questionable. There's a little dot up in the corner, and you say, I think this is a false news story.
It says right there, disputed by Associated Press and Snopes.com.
But if you go to the one to the right there, it's also what's going on, and there you have an option to report this as false news.
Yeah, you can report it.
And this is new. They didn't have this before, like the false news option, that's pretty new. Another thing that Facebook has done is, it used to be that if you posted a story, you could change the headline before you posted it, published it. So the story maybe said something, it's going to be sunny today, and you could change it, it's going to rain today, and you post it. So people that don't click on the link would see it as saying that Press Democrat is saying it's going to rain today. You can't do that no longer. They blocked that. And that's a way for them to prevent false fake news shopping around.
But now you had your own experience where you tried to post something that was fake.
Yeah, and this is a while back there was a story, or not that long ago, from InfoWars claiming that Michelle Obama really is a man. Have you seen that video? So that video is still up on Facebook, and there's no fact check or news alert or anything around it. And there are a couple of examples of that. So definitely still have more work to do when it comes to calling it out and finding it. So they're still floating around. And I would say on Twitter, they have been the most reluctant one to do much. It's really been slow there. And they claim like the way it's so fast, the feed is so fast, so they feel like a lot of users call out each other if something is incorrect. And I mean, it's hard. I met with Facebook last year when I was at the Online News Association conference, and I sat and talked to some of their people, and they were like, so how do newspapers feel about Facebook? And I said, well, we have a mixed feelings about you. We love and we hate you. We love it. We get traffic, but it's definitely a constant struggle. What we post, how we show up, what other kind of stories show up outside us, etc. And they were fairly surprised when I said that. So it's still a lot learning to do on the Facebook side too.
Well, for a long time, Facebook basically took a hands-off approach, saying it's not our problem to deal with it. They also took the position that they were not responsible for any fake news prior to the election. After the stories were released, where they acknowledged there were some fake Facebook sites that were being used to distribute information and ads. This was a very rare quote from the head of Facebook security, Alex Stamos. He says, "We know we have to stay vigilant to keep ahead of people who try to misuse our platform. We believe in protecting the integrity of civil discourse." So it's the first time they're really acknowledging, yeah, we do have a role to play here. And as I understand it, all of this information is now part of Mueller's investigation into possible collusion with Russia, and Facebook is potentially going to be speaking to the grand jury. They have been asked to turn over some information on what they know.
But it's also telling that it's so easy to post an ad or to target a story, and we do that all the time. We want to target only a Roanoke Park audience, and we want to target women between 40 and 50. Everyone can do that. So of course the Russians can do it too. It's Facebook and Google, they're stuck with they're so good at their technology, so it's a problem.
Tell me, it is true that a lot of these stories kind of circumvent traditional news media like the Press Democrat, but at the same time, you get swept up in this. How do you respond when people call or write or leave comments saying what you just posted was fake news?
So we noticed this started coming a lot right before the elections, much more calling out fake news, and the trolls kind of came out from under the rocks and really started say everything they didn't agree with was fake news. And I was very adamant to respond to every one of these comments, pretty much. Me or my staff, and we were always like, what do you mean? What is fake news? What is it that's wrong with the story? We know the facts are correct. And usually it was ideology. They didn't agree with the story. So it wasn't really the facts, it was the idea behind it. We also noticed a lot about opinion pieces written by Paul and his team, and they were confused. Because it's hard, if you read a traditional newspaper in print, it's very easy to understand. This is news, this is editorial. Online, it's mixed. It's harder to see that it's an editorial piece, even though it says so in the headline usually, and that confused a lot of people. You have to say it like 3 times, call it out, put it in a flash alert. This is an opinion piece.
Well, and we've had this conversation. We did in our conversations on the phone leading up to this panel discussion that my concern is when people watch TV news, broadcast networks, there is no clear transition from news to opinion. In fact, I would argue on some of the shows, certainly in the middle of the day, CNN, Fox, they're all guilty of this. They'll give you 30 seconds of news and then 29 and a half minutes worth of opinion by a panel of experts, and within minutes they're all yelling at each other. And there's a seamless transition from news to opinion. How much of this is affecting what people call fake news?
Well, I think it really impacts them, and I used to say, when I say this is an opinion piece, they don't know what I'm talking about because they don't read newspapers. So they have no idea that there's a difference.
Do any others have thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because I've watched the first 2 episodes of Ken Burns' thing about Vietnam, and let's not forget that a lot of what we were getting from our administration for the first 5 years, or maybe throughout the whole war, was fake news. We were getting disinformation from Robert McNamara. So it's certainly hard to tell the difference between fake news and real news sometimes. As you say, people who are on the receiving end of criticism are always going to say that something is fake. And back to the legal aspect of it, if somebody's reputation is really damaged by a knowing falsehood or by a fabrication, they can sue. And interestingly enough, Trump and a lot of folks on his side are sort of reinvigorating the libel laws, or they would like to do that. But I don't think they're going to succeed in that. I think they have a better chance of succeeding in creating fake news than they do in winning in court.
Well, it's interesting because actually in our libel laws, there are more protections for opinion under the fair comment and criticism rule. That if something is clearly an opinion, it has protections against being a libelous statement of its own. Dave, do you have a question?
Yeah, I want to say that all of you are here and we're talking about this kind of big change, but what we're challenged to do is teach people how to exercise judgment. That's the challenge. We're teaching judgment. And think about this in the classroom, or when you're reading the paper, or when you're online. This is a terribly difficult task to teach judgment. Because how do you teach judgment? Through experience, through maturity, and I don't mean age, I mean being exposed to lots of different things and being able to grab those things and exercise some level of discretion about them. So anything that advances us, not just this panel, but legislatively or in terms of a principle, that can add to teaching judgment is going to improve civic discourse. Because that's the real challenge. How do we teach judgment? And if you have ideas about this, when you come up and ask questions, I'm all ears about how to do that. Because teaching judgment is probably the biggest challenge that I have as a longtime educator, and I think that the media has, and that Carl has as an attorney, as what we post online. All of us have this difficulty of teaching judgment.
But I mean, it was before and during the election, it was also this notion of you have to call out lies. And that whole conversation was kind of new, because usually in elections, the debates didn't go that far. But now it's actually the news, the TV, paper, everyone, they have to really call out, this is actually not correct. And be more active on that.
Right. In September of the election, in September 2016, the New York Times made the editorial decision for the first time to call out falsehoods. It took until September 2016, which is pretty late in the game, for the old great lady, the paper of record, to decide that they're going to call out falsities. And it's great that they did that, but I would argue that's too late.
Well, the fallout from that, though, also is the fact that if you just focus on the lies, you get a lot of Trump coverage. I don't know how else to say that. And then now we're second guessing, was that in and of itself a product of what happened with our election? And so, is there a point at which the media just doesn't cover it, right? I mean, we're in uncharted territory here. We've never had a president tweet out the kinds of things he does, where it could be tomorrow's front page story every day almost. And we're trying to figure out, how to cover all this.
But I think it comes down to human beings, right? It's Thanksgiving dinner, or it's on the Facebook wall, whatever it is, and you see people claiming things that are incorrect. You always should call that out. As a human being, between each other, you say, actually, why are you saying this? Or what's your source? Do you have any more information on this? Or why are you claiming this? And have that conversation, because as long as people claim it and no one objects to it, it's going to stay as true. And that's easy for everyone to do. That's the easiest part.
Carl?
There's a great quote from journalist Walter Lippmann, who said, "The news of the day as it reaches the newspaper office is an incredible medley of fact, propaganda, rumor, suspicion, clues, hopes, and fears. And the task of selecting and ordering that news is one of the truly sacred and priestly offices in a democracy." And of course now, as David said, you don't have those gatekeepers to the same degree, and it falls on every one of us to perform that truly sacred and priestly office.
Well, I appreciate you bring that up, Carl, because that's one of the things I think people take for granted is how much vetting goes on inside traditional news media. And when people say, you know, well, I didn't like the letter you ran yesterday, I usually respond by saying, well, you should see the letter I didn't run. And that's kind of a sample of what we deal with all the time. For every story Annika's in charge of editing and getting out there, there's 10 others that were just forget it. We don't want to be a part of it. And yet now people can bypass this entirely, and as David was saying, go straight to the public themselves.
Which, you know, it's not entirely a bad thing, because, you know, they used to say that the press is only free if you own it. But that's not so much true anymore, because now there is the ability to participate in social media. So, you know, maybe the 9 letters that you didn't run, some of them probably were worth running.
No, they weren't.
But I should also add that the way the newsroom works is like we pretty much read everything. We read all the comments we get on articles, on Facebook. We read all the letters we get, pretty much everything. So it's not that we don't care, we try to ignore it. We really read it, most of it. And we really try to think about, are we objecting, are we doing this, should we do this instead? We have a constant discussion on it, because you have to keep that, you know, be very clear on what you're doing and why you're posting it. So it's not that we ignore it and we read it.
Can I go back I want to go back to this story, Pizzagate. And this is an example of what I think is perhaps the most insidious of fake news, and it really requires 3 things of readers to buy into. One is whatever nonsense that they're publishing is true, right? You have to sort of accept that there's truth. Second is that there's a presumption that whoever published this story about Hillary Clinton being behind some sex trafficking scandal, that there had some sort of standard for determining whether the truth is there. That they evaluated it, and because we've been training readers for so long, that there's some sort of vetting going on, and so whoever looks at this says, yeah, somebody actually did the research, and this must be true. And the third is perhaps the most difficult, and that is the reader has to believe that the only reason that this is the only person publishing this information is because everybody else is conspiring to keep the truth away. That the mainstream media is part of a large conspiracy to hold the truth for you and from you, and I am going to be the one person that's going to tell you the truth, and led this guy to get in his car and drive to D.C. and shoot up the place. The question is, where does this come? Is this part of this Hollywood scenario, this narrative? One guy against the government and all the establishment, that somehow we're willing to believe, that as part of our willingness to believe that these things are true?
Well, I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think like maybe we have failed in our education system.
Yeah.
Like, are people getting enough education? Like, are they learning these things? It's just a question that keeps coming up, right?
Right, and there was a study out from Stanford that showed, you know, that 85% of 8th graders couldn't discern real news from fake news, right? But the reality is that only 40% of adults think they can, or 2/3 of adults acknowledge that they have a hard time selecting. But it is part of that whole thing of credibility. Who are you going to believe? So let's go on to the question is, where do we go from here? What do we do? There was according to a survey by the Pew Research Center, only 39% of American adults felt very confident that they can recognize news that is made up. In the survey of more than 1,000 adults, 23% they had shared a fake news story. 14% they had shared a story that they knew was fake at the time, and they shared it anyway. And 16% said they shared a story they later learned was fake, and to some degree regretted it. So then we have ways that you can find. So maybe if you want to, I'll throw this out to you. What can discerning readers do about determining what's fake and what's real? I'll throw that out. Annika, you want to start with that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of good websites. Snopes.com is great. They usually have the top hot 50, the latest crazy 50 fake stories, or maybe fake stories. Sometimes they're true, right? But they check them, the ones that you wonder about. It's actually really fun to go and look at that every day using new things. That's one. And I think we had a factcheck.org, a lot of political news in there too.
This one is particularly good. I like because they actually break it down. It's not just political news or bloggers, but real facts about science, health, and they actually go into it. Not only tells you whether something's false, but it will give you the information that you can then share on what is the accurate answers to these things.
So a political fact obviously is a lot about politics.
Yeah, and they have this little truthometer, which I love, and they're not just going after things that are said on the news media anymore. They go after things that are circulating in blogs as to what, and they have true, false, and then of course my favorite, pants on fire false, and some of these they'll go after the bloggers on that as well. And here's sort of a slide that Annika put together on how to trust a true story.
Here are a couple of things. Has the site, the author, like if you, obviously, you know probably the big media names, New York Times, etc., you should pretty much always assume that they have fact-checked everything a lot of times, so that makes it easy, right? But if your news site you don't really know about, you can check a couple of things on it. You can check if the site has received any awards. That's usually a good sign that it's trustworthy. If the author has received any awards, you should see if the author actually what else the author has written. Byline, check the byline, what else have they done? Check if they have a LinkedIn account, if it looks credible. Does the article have a date? And does it link to credible sources? Ideally should link to some. If it's sourcing studies, it should link to university or some kind of like science report. Does that make sense? Correct spelling and grammar, it's always a hint too. And it's actually if the design is okay, if the website looks like work, like it looks professional, that's usually a help too.
Yeah, but looks can be deceiving, so going in deeper, looking background. I know the Danger and Play, Cernovich's website looks. What does it look like? It looks like a newspaper because they're calling upon that trust is built over a long time that these are credible sources. So we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. If I could have one of my editors. I have one of my editors here. Shannon, would you mind taking the? I didn't see you. Would you mind taking the microphone and taking it around to people? So, and then I also have, if anybody feels more comfortable, just filling out a card. We have cards here. If anybody would like, just raise your hand and we'll hand you a card.
Hi, I'm wondering, we've been watching a lot of news for almost at least a year where, like on CNN, they just go on and on and on about the nuances of what Trump said, and we're not getting any other news. And it seems to me like that's a whole fake news in itself. It's just like a foil. It's keeping us from really understanding the dynamics of what's going on in the world because everyone's just focusing on trying to figure out what's actually happening. And we're just spinning our wheels just listening to CNN talk about, or go on Fox or MSNBC, but it's just like a lot of junk. It feels to me like news has gone into junk, at least on the nightly news.
You want to answer that one, Dana?
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point. I think news outlets are in a little bit of a conundrum. What the things that this president does and says are more newsworthy more frequently, I think it's safe to say, than any previous president by far. He's done so many things differently, unconventionally, for many people disturbingly, that it demands being covered, right? But it can go too far. Earlier in the Trump administration, back in February and March, there were several weeks where I'd read about a story, something he said to the president of Mexico or somebody that was shocking, and it was news. In any ordinary news cycle, that story would have been a week-long story, and it would have been examined in depth and in detail, and we would still be talking about that on Friday if it happened on Monday. But he did 4 more things like that in the following 24 hours, and by Friday, you forgot that he even said this thing to the president of Mexico. It was so crazy and newsworthy. So, yes, I think that there's a lot of news-making going on in the Trump administration, far more than any previous administration. I think the media, and I think television media probably is more culpable of this than print, but I think it falls in both camps, are guilty of overemphasizing all the stuff that Trump does. You got to cover the other things too. And I think that the biggest newspapers, the biggest news outlets are covering those other things, but they may be burying them at the back of the paper because it's hard to deny that when the President of the United States threatens the President of Australia, one of our closest allies, you got to cover that, right? That's a story that the newspapers can't ignore. But I think maybe one larger point that you're getting to is that Trump, by his very nature, and I think he's always been this way, sort of sucks up all the oxygen in the room, and that there are a lot of other things going on in our country that matter. Fortunately, one of the upsides of the crumbling of the old model of media, the gatekeeper model, is that there are all kinds of websites, some very good, that cover very specific issues and do it pretty well. So if you really are interested in what's going on at the EPA, which I think there's a lot of newsworthy stuff going on at the EPA, but you may not see that in the New York Times, but on page 6 or 7 or 8. So there are other sites that cover these kinds of things. You can go to those.
David, do you have a thought?
Sure. I bring you some good news, all right? Not much happens in politics that isn't pre-canned or walked through. But repeated exposure to false information backfires. And we know this from a lot of different data analysis. The campaign is over, but they're still running that contrasting differential campaign, shooting everything out from a fire hose, and the media has to mitigate or make editorial decisions about what to cover.
From it, yeah.
They have to drink from it, and that's by conscious design. They've reached a period where they can't continue to do that, because at some point you have to deliver when you own the government. So the good news is that the model that got them there has to change or shift. Perhaps not by September 30th or by December 15th, 2 key dates that have changed recently for the dynamic, but certainly when we enter the 2018 election period. In other words, elections have consequences, and elections matter. So what got you to this place and the model that they use is going to work for 1 in 3 voters. It's going to work for 35%. It's not going to work for 15 or 16% of the voters that get you over the hump to win re-election in 2020. So they have to change their model. And I would argue to David that they will change their model, but the place that they've gotten to so far and getting the media to make editorial decisions about what to cover, that's going to change because the media will tire of it, the administration will tire of it, and the only people left standing will be the family around him, and that will be difficult moving forward. So the model is going to shift. The frustration that you have will shift. It's going to shift slowly, but it's going to take 6 to 12 months for that to happen.
Another question.
I just appreciate some comments on the differences with fake news and satire and comedy. I think a lot of us get our news now from some of the comedians and who have to point out that their stories are satire. And also thinking about Al Franken, how he had to shut down his comedy for a while until he could become respected as a senator, and the way they used his comedy against him when he was originally running for office. I just appreciate some comments on that area.
Anybody want to take that on?
It's interesting because there's an old California case where somebody sued the San Francisco Bay Guardian for libel because they had published an April Fool's edition quoting a prominent San Francisco landlord as saying, I use electroshock therapy all the time on my tenants. It does wonders. So he sued them for libel, saying, you fabricated this, you damaged my reputation. And they pointed out, dude, this was in our April Fool's edition, which was upside down. So I think that is perhaps the definition between satire, or the distinction between satire or comedy on the one hand and fake news.
And the courts have protected satire. I mean, by and large, that if it's something that's clear, it falls under that fair comment and criticism statute. Yeah. Did you?
So here's the sobering academic problem with that, though. False truths get misremembered. And when satire presents false truths, particularly around race, ethnicity, and culture, that compounds what voters treat as true or not. So satire, while protected, if it becomes your principal news source, you can misremember that, and if those issues are around gender issues or cultural issues or race issues, they get magnified by fake news. So we create a vicious cycle that puts eyeballs on and ears to these comedian, to Stephen Colbert, right, or The Daily Show, or whatever it is. But at some point, we have a lot of research that suggests that that becomes its own self-fulfilling prophecy of negativity, reinforcing fake news. That becomes a bit of a problem, and how do you legislate or litigate that? Because now you're into a real First Amendment issue when we protected this.
Yeah, and it's a double-edged sword because even Alex Jones from InfoWars, he's going through a sad divorce, but he basically said in divorce court that what he does on air is an act, and it's just part of his persona, and that's not really true. So it's sort of a blending of entertainment and news, and it's sometimes hard for consumers to be able to separate the two. Any other thoughts on that? We'll move on. But it is a good question. Now, remember, all good satire has an element of truth, though, too. Yes? Well, that's definitely true, and there's certain. The comment was that going back to Germany, the more you tell a lie, the more it becomes a truth. And as you were saying, the more it becomes, people have developed false memories of this.
Yeah, I mean, I run a survey in a large class of several hundred students, and have reported the results over 15 years. Did the Holocaust ever happen? And of course, you get yes or no. I don't know, no opinion, and you get a data spread. And then you say, is it possible or plausible the Holocaust never happened? And the numbers don't double to yes, that it may not have happened. The numbers triple. They go from the teens to the 30s. And this has been data I've collected over 15 years. And so I think the speaker there, or the questioner there, you bring up a very good point. It's something we have to be cognizant and vigilant of. That's the role of the media, I think, as well, to provide help and reinforce those types of falsehoods when they come out.
It's interesting. There was a survey recently showing to it one way of pushing facts, or trying to tell people the facts, is videos are much more forceful than text. So videos posted on social media, for example, proving this is the case, Holocaust actually happened, have much more impact than if you read it somewhere.
The campaigns call that psychographics. That's exactly what Cambridge Analytica, the Trump organization or a firm that ran Project Alamo, then they created those psychographics to take advantage of it. They pioneered one of those that area.
Well, that's what we'll call our next panel, psychographics panel discussion. I do want to get to a question that came from our online viewers on Facebook Live. This one, the question is, and I'll direct this to Carl, how does fake news not fall under yelling fire in a crowded theater?
Well, the definition of what's not protected is something that causes sort of imminent, lawless conduct. And, fake news, I think, is not likely to have that effect. It's going to be more insidious. I think maybe the closest thing that comes to yelling fire in a crowded theater is this Pizzagate thing. But, I think normally if you've got something on the internet that we can characterize as fake news, it's not going to have the immediate effect as, say, publishing a secret to the H-bomb, which, is another good example of something that would not be protected by the First Amendment.
Where's our microphone? Okay, there you are.
I'm sorry.
Hi, Liz, thank you.
Hi, so I have an urgent question. I'm hoping you can help me. Can you hear me? Most of the students that I teach, and also I have a daughter in college, they don't read the newspapers, and they aren't watching television news very much, and any of this. And in fact, they don't really use Facebook that much anymore either. They do look at YouTube videos a lot, and I'm wondering if anybody can help me source somebody who is going around the internet and teaching all sorts of things to our kids. I'm wondering if you know who is Black Pigeon Speaks. And if you don't know, then I'm going to ask you to look into it and help me understand how I can figure it out, because I've done just about everything I can do. But when you've got maybe a bot, maybe somebody who I can tell based on watching about 25 of the videos that clearly it's coming from the Trump administration, is somehow really convincing a lot of young people that Black Lives Matter is like racist and all sorts of other things. Very good, open-hearted, liberally raised young people who feel like there's just a lot of common sense in these videos. And so if you've not heard of Black Pigeon Speaks, it's just one more voice out there, and I think that we need to, I'm going to ask you how we can think about those sources of media that our younger people are using, that our students are using, and how we can help them discern, because they don't really care that they don't know the source. They see how many likes there are, and they say, well, everybody else likes them.
It must be true.
It must be true.
Yeah. Anybody want to take an answer, Jonathan?
It's interesting because I consulted with my 21-year-old son before appearing on this panel, and he says Twitter's outdated. He gets most of his news from Reddit. So I think all these things change so quickly.
So Snapchat, a lot of young people, I don't have the numbers, but a lot of young people get all the news from Snapchat, which can make anyone stressed if you're not 25. But they do actually, CNN and a lot of the big news papers and news agencies are actually on Snapchat now because they're trying to reach their audience, and we probably all have to end up on Snapchat or on YouTube for that matter. But it's definitely a challenge. I have 3 kids, and every day I leave the newspaper on the table because I feel like they just see the headlines when they pass by. So they actually do read it, and they read their comics every day. So that's a good step there, but I realize everyone doesn't have a newspaper. But I just feel as a grown-up, you kind of have an obligation. You need to have the radio on with the news at home. You need to have it in the car when you drive them to whatever they're doing. They need to, because we grew up hearing news. Our parents watch the news at night on TV. Now everyone sits and looks on their phones or iPads. So the kids they don't even hear it when they pass by. And that's a parent issue, partly. I just think they need to at least be exposed to it, even if they don't care for it. And then, of course, you have to, it's an education issue again. You have to teach them about sources, even if they don't care and if they don't like. I think you just have to keep talking about it.
Yeah, in our household, the kids are required to read at least 3 stories. You can imagine the eye rolls I get every morning with breakfast. And one of the stories can be about the Warriors or something, but they just have to at least get some diet. And the problem with Snapchat is those things just they disappear as soon as you see it. You don't even have time to correct it; it's already gone and gone from the system. Those of you who use Snapchat. Any other thoughts?
My 26-year-old son reads the New York Times, so that should make you folks.
Yay! We got to breed a new generation.
But I'm always the only person on the train with a newspaper, and I've noticed that people start offering me seats
So here's a question from one of our written questions, and I think Annika and I will take a stab at this. This says, are you implying that traditional media like the PD and the Washington Post and the New York Times aren't politically biased, and that bias affects how they present the news? I'll speak for myself. I oversee the editorial pages, and we are inherently biased. I get complaints all the time that we have bias, and I said, yes, that's what we do. If I'm not running something that's biased, I'm not doing my job. We take positions on things, and we are very clear on, we are an opinion section. Our letter writers, our columnists, our editorial, we take positions. Does our newspaper have a certain perspective? I would say our newspaper reflects our community, and I can say that with pride. Are we going to run a story that's going to say, if we're going to interview half the people who say climate change isn't real and half the people that say it is real? I don't think that's our responsibility. I think we do have to make discerning decisions about certain issues that rise above politics and try to put the truth forward. And that's it, but we wrestle with that all the time. I'm not saying our stories, I'm not saying opinion doesn't creep into our stories. I was a reporter, I was an editor, I see it happen, but we do our best to try to present different perspectives and get it right. And I welcome back those discussions, as to whether or not we're presenting one side more than the other, as opposed to dealing with fake news, which is just this insidious thing. Monica, do you have anything?
Yeah, I'm in newsroom meetings every day, and everything is being discussed. What are we reporting on tomorrow? What's our story? And it's a lot of people weighing in and giving impact to it. And we don't publish anything that has to be confirmed. We always try to have as many different sources we can from both sides. So I think, I would say that serious news organizations, they really aim to be as objective as they possibly can. And that, as far as, they're human beings, but the aim is always to report on what's going on.
And again, we spend a lot of time vetting these things. Some of you may have seen the movie Spotlight about the Boston Globe and their reporting on the abuse that was happening within the Catholic Church. If you see at the end, there were a bunch of other cities where it was happening. Well, Santa Rosa is listed there. And when I joined the Press Democrat 20 years ago, this was a huge issue. And we were wrestling and vetting and getting pushback, but we weren't going to run that story until we had it right. And Kathy Barnett was right at the helm, and I applaud her for pushing that story. And we often have people internally that get mad that we're not running the story when they think it's right, and our editors are pushing back, say it's not ready. And this kind of vetting and back and forth doesn't occur on these one-person, two-person operations in social media. They just run with stuff when they get it, and that's how you end up with stories that says Hillary Clinton has Parkinson's, and it's all only based on the testimony of one anesthesiologist. So anyway, that's so we have where's our David? Do you want to say something?
Just a quick point. I think the Mike Cernoviches of the world are an overreaction to a problem that is real, and that I think the mainstream media either misperceives or sort of undersells, and that is that newspapers are biased, as is any institution run by human beings. I think on a story-by-story basis, newspapers do, for the most part, do a terrific job of getting the facts right, of being objective. I think where the bias creeps in, and there is a left tilt in newsrooms around the country, as anyone who's worked in a newsroom can say, and I think it's been shown, vast majority of reporters are Democrats if they're registered as reporters, and that bias shows up, but I do think it shows up in the selection of stories more than it shows up on a story-by-story basis, and it's hard to deny that the credibility of the mainstream media has taken big hits in recent years, and I think part of it is because newspapers haven't dealt honestly with that fact, but that bias is nowhere near what the Mike Cernoviches of the world do, which is to take facts with a specific political objective in mind and promote them, facts and quotation marks, promote outright falsehoods or innuendo with a sort of specific political objective in mind and with knowledge that what they're doing is false. Any self-respecting mainstream media organization wouldn't do that. But I do think there's bias that just seeps into anything humans do. I think most newspapers operate under professional standards that minimize that, but it can't be avoided entirely because humans are humans.
If I could make a plug for the First Amendment Coalition, it's that I think some of the problem is that government is so stingy with access to information, and that's one of the important things that the First Amendment Coalition does, is it fights for access to information. And I'm a Democrat, and we spent a lot of time trashing Donald Trump, but here in deep blue California, we've got a lot of state and local governments that are not wanting information to get out, and you've got governments that are hiring former reporters for twice what they were earning when they were telling the truth, working for newspapers. So maybe that's not fake news, but the government always says, "Oh, we're committed to transparency," but
until they don't want it.
Until they get elected.
Right. Yeah. And I know on our pages and opinion pages, we often are questioned, why don't you have more pro-Trump stuff on our opinion pages? And I will say it's not from a lack of looking. Even our most conservative, columnists, you read them: George Will, Charles Krauthammer, David Brooks, Jennifer Rubin. All of them are beaten up on Trump more than our progressive columnists are. Even our conservative political cartoonists, it's hard to get something out that's showing a different side. So there's a lot of things. It's a new dynamic out there. I want to get to a few more questions before. Who has the microphone? Raise your hand if you have a. Who's been holding up there? Oh, how about Lynn right here? She has our former Congresswoman Lynn Woolsey is here with us.
We live, luckily, in one of the best educated parts of the country, our very own county, and certainly northern the North Bay. Even then, 25% of our population reads at an 8th grade level or below. Right here, we have to do something about our educating of our children, and they have to learn critical thinking. We can't tell them how to figure out fake news. We can tell them to think and teach them how to think. And we don't do it. And if we're not even doing it here, imagine, and this is going to be very biased, Mississippi. I mean, they don't do it. So that's up to us. It's up to parents. One of our high schools just recently dropped cursive because it was too hard in high school. I know it's a waste of time. It teaches something, discipline. We've got to have our kids want to learn what they need to know. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, that's the question. Are we doing enough to teach critical thinking? And is that the ingredient to getting them to the point? I mean, what about your kids? Do you see them doing that? Are they learning that in school?
Well, they use Google for everything, and they're also told that they're not allowed to use Wikipedia as a source, so they have to look for more sources. So that's pretty good.
Yeah.
And they're also told they have to look a couple of sources. So I think I'm pretty optimistic about it. Yeah.
We have some teachers here. Maybe you have some thoughts.
I'd love to respond. I've been teaching for 35 years in the Santa Rosa City Schools. I'm also Vice Mayor of Mansell and Hillsburg. And so I have two hats here. And when I heard about this tonight, I really wanted to come because I feel there's a conflict in just the concept of freedom at the same time allowing fake news to exist. And so one of the shows that I showed, I teach high school English in Santa Rosa, and one of the shows that was really interesting to me was Newsroom. I used that as much as I could when it first came out, because I thought Solkin actually had a really good methodology when he started that out. The famous Jeff Daniels speech, as everybody remembers, is America the greatest country? And now we have it on baseball hats for an election. But the greatness of the country, but the greatness of that show, and I'm not hyping it, except it was helpful as a teacher, trying to teach judgment. We do it through literature and the humanities. But my deepest fear is that people want to criticize education rather than look at what the components are in the adult society around us. And to own a bit of your own screen use and your own willingness to, no offense to anyone personally, but when we continue to say all these statistics about reading levels, Solkin's argument, and I think it was beautiful, I hope he wrote that episode, the second one, is this something that's going to help in the voting booth? Is this going to help? Do you give a historical context to a controversial issue? Do you remember that show? They had an incident about whatever it was, the oil spill, and then they actually showed what the newsroom did to create a way for people that saw that show to actually understand it. So I think we are teaching, I really am not defensive here, I know I've been teaching thinking through literature study and writing and definitely analysis of argument. The Common Core standards invite us and require us to do that. But it's a myth to think that that's going to happen in the classroom alone when our own population isn't mirroring that. And I think that the media does have a responsibility to do more contextual work. So, for example, if a kid cites a quote in my class, what's the context of the quote? Give me some history, give me some backdrop, don't just throw quotes out. And I feel like we get way too many quotes and not enough. So today I showed Trump's speech to the UN. I showed the whole thing to the speech and debate class, some of my students. And they watched the whole thing, and I said, you have to stay awake, stay up. And some of them hate Trump. They hate him, okay? They literally cannot. One girl said, I'm getting sick. I said, stay with us, that's the president, and let's just figure out what he's actually arguing for. Let's look at this from a constructivist. And the bottom line is, if you don't see the whole speech, if you just get the soundbite, so as a teacher and a politician now, local government, I just want to caution us all to not just keep pointing at education, but look at it. We all need to get educated about what we're putting up with when we get our news. So nothing against the news people, but you have a responsibility to give context and also help us in the voting booth more. So thank you.
We love Ms. Mansell. She's a council member up in Healdsburg, in case we didn't mention that, but she also brought a number of her students here tonight who are in high school, brought them all the way here, and we appreciate that.
My name is Ruth Moore, and I know Bridget quite well. Bridget and I have served on a number of committees together, but I want to echo some of her comments. I also do not want to sound defensive as a public school teacher. I teach K-3 humanities, and I'm also a teacher on special assignment, partnering with UC Berkeley to bring their form of professional development to Sonoma County, to Santa Rosa City Schools specifically, to equip teachers with the capacities that they need to deliver critical thinking strategies and lessons to all students and not just some students. So I do think that there are shifts that can be made in the world of education. I do believe, like Bridget said, that the Common Core standards are a huge boost to us because they do focus so much more on critical thinking, including the smarter balanced assessment test. So I don't know if you had a chance to look at that test. It is qualitatively hugely different from the tests prior to that, which were 80% lower depth of knowledge questions, and these are now sort of 80% higher depth of knowledge questions. So the testing's on board, the standards are on board, but I agree with Bridget that we don't function in a vacuum. So just today, I was grading some reading logs. I'm not actually grading them, I'm reviewing them to see how well are my 8th graders reading literature. And I'm talking about how do they interpret specific words, specific lines. And I can compare that because I had a little hoarding problem with student work from the last 20 years. So I can compare that with 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and I can see how much more difficult it is for my 8th graders to go home and have that kind of laser focus, quality, space, and time to do the kind of reading you need to do in order to become good judgment of sources and also critical thinkers.
Yeah.
So I do need to ask for partnership with the community. I have moved some of the reading I assigned at home into the class so we can specifically talk about what deep reading and thinking looks like.
So yeah, and you're right. We do not live in a bubble. We do not live in a vacuum. The question is, do we live in bubbles? You know, how do we all live in our own little bubbles, and you're right, we all have our own little screen times. You know, how do we burst those bubbles, and what's going to bring us together?
So I have a simple solution or proposal to at least get through some of these bubbles in community from an education perspective. If we took a few politicians at the state level, state offices, and put their district offices on campus, and a couple of nonprofits that serve the county, and put them on campus because the bus system runs through here. Now our students run into politicians and their staffs. Now our students run into community partners who are out the nonprofit community dealing with some of the most difficult problems in our society. That would create a real university community where people are actually colliding into each other, breaking some of these barriers down, and make things a lot easier as an educator that aren't just solo as to what's happening in the classroom with our theories and big ideas, but what's happening outside. It'd be a simple experiment, an easy thing to do. We're not asking for a lot of politicians to do this or a lot of nonprofits to do this, but it would create a better community to exchange ideas of a university that's a much better partner and neighbor for all of our neighbors, not just solo here, isolated for our folks that are 18 to 22.
A couple more questions, and then we're going to wrap it up. Do you want to?
I just have a comment. I wish media would not put. Oh, thank you. I thought I had a pretty loud voice. I wish the media would not put the distinction of whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, whether it's CNN or in the paper or whatever. When I read a comment, I want to be able to determine whether I think that argument has value. And I do see that little D or that little R, and I kind of make assumptions. I know that I do. And if we could remove that, I think that that would require more judgment from all of us on the words of the people.
So you're referring to D and R when we refer to a legislator, like in Congress, an elected official.
Yeah.
We'll list them as Democrat, San Francisco, Republican.
Big names are known, of course, but a lot of times some of the legislative people who are elected, we don't know their names and we don't know their parties. And the last thing is, I too am a retired educator, and I used to do a profile. What do you do? And one of the things that I noticed, I grew up talking to my mom and dad and my sisters at the dinner table every night, and very few of my students actually have a sit-down dinner with their families in the evening. That's it. I'm off my soapbox.
Well, that's certainly part of the problem that we're exploring here, is it goes beyond just the newspapers you get in the morning, but it really gets into the social fabric and what's happening in our households, how people are interacting. Jake, did you have a question?
Oh, it's one of the things that gets.
I'm always hesitant to pass the microphone to Jake McKenzie, our counsel.
This will be brief. Does this work?
Yeah, just hold it close.
Very close. One of my pet peeves in local government has been the propensity of people to identify local elected officials at city and county level by their partisan affiliations, Republican and Democrats. We may be registered as a Republican or a Green or an Independent or a Democrat, but under the California Constitution, we run as nonpartisan representatives of our city or of our county in this state of California. I got that off my chest. I feel a lot better, I think.
Well, I agree with you, Jake. We try not to, for those, we have partisan offices for our state legislators and their congressional representatives, but not at the local level. And the old argument was there's not a Republican or a Democratic way to fix a pothole. We're all in this together at the local level, and but somehow that's been lost at the national level. Any other? We have a student who wants to ask a question here.
So, as a student standpoint, and as a child standpoint under the age of 18, most of the children's role models are adults, and what we look up to, like how they act, and we try to follow them. In psychology, the child brains adjust to their environment. So when, like, Washington Post, New York Times, Press Democrat, they show posts of these adults who are misacting and acting what they shouldn't be, how do we how do kids who barely know what to do try to change and think they're doing the wrong and not the right?
So what do kids do about responding to that, or do you think it's too much of an influence on kids?
It's also those both.
Okay. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
No, again, and I'm not saying I'm doing it all the time, but I think we all as grown-ups have an obligation to talk to our kids and every day and sit down and have dinner and talk to them and rip the screens from their hands and just have a conversation and then give them a book. My kids roll their eyes when I say this, but I just think it's a constant conversation, and it has to be based on facts and on looking for facts and not always ideology when you talk to kids or other people, but just focus on the real deal and talk more. And less phone time, which I look at my screen too much too. But I'm just saying that whole conversation has to happen.
Less screen time.
It's really simple. When you're of age, don't just register to vote. Vote.
Yeah.
There were 94 million people that didn't vote this last election, who were registered, eligible to vote, and stayed home. Vote. Pretty simple.
Great point. You and I talk about that a lot. You know, what did Hillary end up getting? 67 million votes. Trump 63 million, and the non-voters, they got 95 million.
Yeah, 93.6 million people registered, eligible to vote, didn't vote.
Is that a valid message or not? Is that a valid message to get engaged? I would say so.
Those who don't vote.
Who make the decision?
Are they telling us something about what we are doing for us about the candidate?
Well, what's the alternative? Okay.
Yeah, some percentage.
Yeah. So, any final thoughts, anybody? We got to start wrapping it up. We've covered a lot of territory here tonight. I will say that in terms of the talking like a pirate, you guys all failed miserably, but everything else was very illuminating, enlightening, and please give a round of applause to our panelists. I do want to thank all our Sonoma State Star editors. I want to call out Shannon Brown in particular. She's the editor of the Sonoma State Star. All our staff members who helped. I want to mention Deb Pruitt from the First Amendment Coalition, who did a marvelous job in helping us get organized. She worked with that. I'm not even sure she got a chance to listen very much tonight, but she did fabulous. I just want to remind everybody that this forum will be available on PressDemocrat.com if you want to go back and have a look. And thank you to everyone who joined us on Facebook Live. We hope to see you all again at our next forum. On behalf of the Sonoma State Star and the Press Democrat and the First Amendment Coalition, we thank you all for coming. Have a good evening and drive safely.